part of the World War II Veterans Project. And we have with us for the second time today Mr. Jack Strouss, S-T-R-O-U-S-S, to describe vividly what it was like to be on a shipping sink in the English Channel on his way to France. In his last interview, and he's going to talk about the end of the war, the Remagen Bridge, where he was as the war ended, going into Paris and into Berlin, and what it was like in Europe after the war, and how the people responded to him and how he responded to them. Jack, we're delighted to have you back again and appreciate you being here.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure. Well, I believe we left off when our 15th Army headquarters is located in a small town on the Rhine River called Bad Nauheim. B-A-D, Bad is the German word for bath, of course, and there were a lot of those spa towns in that area, and we were involved with several of them at one time or another. But while we were there, this was in March, and the first crossing of the Rhine River at the Remagen Bridge was made, and that was a railroad bridge that the Germans had planned to blow up, but something had happened, and they didn't get the charges right anyway. Our troops got there before the bridge fell, and in fact, after they made the first crossing, they found the charges under the bridge that were ready to, blow. But the next day, I think the bridge only lasted, you mentioned it, probably 48 hours. It wasn't very long, but it was a bridgehead, very important. It allowed them to get to the other side so that the Army engineers could come along and do pontoon bridges below and above to make a real beachhead at that point. But some people I knew from Army headquarters had business on the other side, and one of the guys that I knew said, we got this command car. It was a Plymouth, just like a regular civilian car, but painted OD, and I said, oh boy, we get to ride a real automobile. They said, come along just for the ride. So I sat in the back seat, and they went, and we went down sort of the Rhine River. Most of it, a lot of it is in a kind of a gorge. Anyway, we were up high in this little town, so we worked our way down, went to the bridgehead, and we were allowed to cross. The engineers had laid some kind of covering, I don't remember what it was, over the railroad tracks so that it was a passable bridge. So we drove on over, and they did their business, and I looked around, and I didn't leave the end of the bridge. I just waited for them to pick me up, and they weren't gone just a few minutes. It was a quick thing. Came right back, and we went back to our headquarters. That was, I didn't think at the time that would be anything to remember particularly, but in view of the later circumstances, it was quite a thing that I got to go across, and I wasn't even a infantry or tank people at all. There, I just went along for a ride to some official stuff. Anyway, we went back to headquarters, and we worked on for about another 5 or 6 weeks. Let's see, that would get us through April, and another ride I had. It seemed like I had 2 or 3 interesting rides. We had a signal corps, I guess it was, a piece of cryptographic material that, or a device that had to be taken to SHAEF headquarters in Paris to be either repaired or something done to it. And so these gentlemen that were taking it down had to have people ride along riding shotgun, as we say, and so they asked for a couple of volunteers, and I'd never been to Paris, so I threw my hand up and I said, I don't care, if the weather's terrible, I'll go. So we went in an open Jeep, 2 of us in the back seat, and the driver and the fellow with the cryptographic machine. So we drove on toward Paris, and it was a overcast day, cold. We were bundled up like crazy. It was probably in the 30s. It wasn't snowing. And on the way to Paris, from where we were up in the Rhine, we had to, Rhine River Valley, we had to go through the city of Reims. It's hard, it took me a long time to pronounce that, R-E-I-M-S, but they would pronounce it Reims. So we approached the city. It was fairly level, no skyscrapers. In the middle of it, 5 or 6 miles away, stood this enormous, fabulous cathedral that many people have seen pictures of. I knew what it was, and I thought, oh boy, I get to see that at a distance like that. Well, I didn't know that the guys were going to stop, so I don't know why they did. Maybe it was the middle of the day. We stopped for lunch, one of our billets that took care of people, transients like that. So while that was going on, I said, I'm going to run up here and take a look at this cathedral if I can find it. By that time, we were down in the town, surrounded by low buildings. I couldn't see anything how to get there, and I just took off and walked a couple of blocks, made a left turn, and luckily there it was, about a block away right in front of me. I was astounded. What a fabulous, beautiful building, and so out of character with what I'd been used to seeing, and it was untouched by the war. And gray day that it was, the stone seemed to have a kind of a rose tint to it. It didn't look like the gray surroundings. So I walked on up. It was open, of course, and there were a few people about, and as most big cathedrals of that size, churches have little side chapels all along, and then the main altar at the far end at the east end. And there were a few people in the little chapels, but not much activity going on. And as I walked all the way down the nave and I got to near the altar end, and I was looking up at this way vaulted ceiling, and there was some strange things hanging there, and they looked like conical shaped hats. That's what they were. So I was able to ask someone in the building who spoke English what that was, and every time either a bishop or an archbishop of that parish died, his hat, which was shaped like that, the red hat, was put on a wire or a string and hauled up into that vaulted ceiling in the chancel area. And there were several hanging there. Some had been, I guess, maybe 200 or 300 years, because they didn't look red anymore. They'd been so long. And then there was some more recent colors. That was an interesting little thing that I just happened to remember. I'd forgotten about it till today, and we started talking about all that. Anyway, we went back and found the fellows, and we got back in the Jeep and went on to Paris. And it was April at that time. And we must have crossed some kind of a weather front. It was unbelievable. You remember the old song, April in Paris? Well, it was April in Paris, and trees were coming out about like you'd expect here in early April, maybe late March. And so they had their business to do. I had about 2 days, and we had billets at some of them were Red Cross hotels. They were regular hotels that had been taken over by the Army for transit people. So we had a place to stay, and a nice place for Chow. Mess halls were along the Champs-Élysées were 2 or 3 big old, I guess they'd been restaurants, more like a cafeteria type. They weren't fancy restaurants, just open storefront, but they were on the main drag there, and so that's where we would eat. So it was beautiful weather, just unbelievable. It changed from that gray business in North France. So we came on, I came on out of the hotel that first morning, and I started walking, and I must have walked all day, and I saw as much as I could. And the next day before we had to leave, and it was beautiful, and I didn't have a camera. They probably wouldn't have let me bring a camera, but I took mental pictures thinking I'd never have a chance to come again. So, but as it would turn out, I had 4 more opportunities later under better circumstances to visit that beautiful city, but I didn't know it at that time. So we went on back to our headquarters, which at that time was, we had left the Rhine area, and we moved on over into northern France, and the fighting was still going on very heavily in that Ruhr area, just across the Remagen area where the first breach was made. And we let's see, I'm trying to get this chronologically correct. We stayed in this place in northern France, which had been a French army post, and it was rather primitive compared to some of the arrangements they've made for us in other places where we were in nice, decent buildings. This was just a very rough barracks. But anyway, it was covered, and we were warm enough. And I remember going in the chow line. This is a sort of a strange thing that happened. I was with all my buddies in big mess hall over here. They were all eating, and I was in the line and getting my food. And there were a lot of displaced people about, and the military had hired them to help wherever they could. And so some of these DPs, as they were called, were serving in the chow line. Well, it got to this one point, and there was a little short fellow on the other side. He took one look at me, and he turned around to the mess sergeant and he said, "Bosh." And I thought, what in the world's going on? So I didn't know the mess sergeant because it was not ours. We were just going through there. I didn't know anybody there, but my guys were already in eating. So he thought I was a spy because there were German Nazis being dropped behind the lines occasionally with paratroops, and they would have our uniforms, which is a bum offense. I mean, that's you stand them right up against the wall and shoot them. They're not in civilian clothes. So anyway, the mess sergeant came around and he took a look at me and he said something, and I spoke to him and I said, "Go in there and ask anybody that knows me." He said, "Well, this he muttered, and he got me by the arm, a big old burly fella, and we walked through and went into the mess hall, and he stood in the door and he made a big holler and said, "Attention," and everybody stopped eating. Must have been 100 people in there, and he yelled out, "Anybody know this man?" Well, all these snickers started coming up. Oh my God, never seen him before since lunch. I mean, it was it was not his fault because this little fella had made a mistake, and he was not even a Frenchman. So, or I mean, an American or any of our allies. He was just a displaced person, maybe a person from the East that the Nazis had brought in and working those people, in their factories. Well, so they just kidded me like crazy for that, and so I sat down and had my lunch, and the mess sergeant came out in a few minutes and brought me an extra dessert. I said, "Well, now, that was a peace offering." It's funny how you remember those little details. Hadn't thought of that in a long time. Anyway, I thought that'd be the end of it. So we were working away in our office the next day, and a couple of guys came in, and they didn't have military insignia. They had uniforms, and they were the equivalent of CIA, I guess. Anyway, they came in following up on this just to be sure. Wanted to see me, wanted to talk to me, wanted to have a lineup. So we went out in the broad open daylight in the parking lot, and there was a whole number of people lined up, GIs. And then this one little lone fellow that had picked me out was standing there by himself with the mess sergeant. So they had his maybe looking the other way, I don't remember, but anyway, they had him look at the group, and he looked up and down, and they said, "Well, do you see him?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, you pointed out this fellow yesterday." So he looked at me and he said, the equivalent of, "Oh no," he said, "I was 6 foot, a little bit over 6 foot at that time." He said, "Oh no, it's petite." So in other words, it was bad, mistaken identity. Fortunately, that ended it, and I got a lot of ribbing for that, for being a Nazi spy.
You didn't get shot?
Didn't get shot. No, went back, and I just had to put up with the ribbing. But, it was kind of funny when it was all over. But I was kind of hacked at the time because I didn't like the idea of having a mistaken identity. Excuse me just a sec. Oh, okay. So we were there. Let's see. I was trying to get this now, exactly the dates. I went back to Paris a second time. This time I had like a weekend pass, and things were slowed down, so the war was just really grinding down to nothing. And we had seen a lot of Germany by this time, just making forays back and forth, and on the other side of the river it was unbelievable, the devastation, because towns weren't damaged, they were flattened.
Yeah.
Literally, and just pushed back the rubble so we could get through. It looked like an earthquake scene.
What was the refugee situation like?
They were everywhere, commandeering every vehicle they could get a hold of, trying to make their way back east. Most of them were from the east. I guess they were Czechs and Poles and whatever. And well, there were some other people too. There were those were the DPs, but there were some other folks who were had been in camps. So on this trip back to Paris the second time, I was in the railroad. I went back on train this time, and I was in the Gare du Nord, the North Railroad station, and there was a whole mob of people civilians standing there waiting for a train. And the train came in. I said, "I'm going to wait and see what this is." And they were French prisoners of war coming home. And oh, that was something to see. And they had been in not necessarily in camps. I think probably a lot of them had been put to work in factories as well. It wasn't just the people from the East. These were, some of the guys had uniforms, some didn't, but there were a lot of happy reunions there.
Yeah,
The families would recognize them. So I had a second trip to Paris, and it was a bright morning. I remember it was, I went down to the mess hall. I knew this area, everything was the same. I went to the same place to eat, and there was French newspapers, and there was the Stars and Stripes with this headline about that high, Roosevelt is mort. And then the Stars and Stripes, Roosevelt has died. And so I felt pretty sad about that, and I went on up the street to the Arc de Triomphe, and I thought, I'm just going to go. I had never been up close. I wanted to see some of the inscriptions, and I walked across this big traffic circle around it, and I went. There was some benches. There are some benches built around the bottom, and so I sat down on the bench there, and an elderly gentleman, French fellow, came over and sat down and just was weeping copiously over this, holding his newspaper. Well, it made me feel real bad, and he was, trying to offer his condolences to me, and I was trying to let him know that, everything's going to be all right. The war is nearly over, and Mr. Truman is a fine man. My French was worth about this much, and he had no English, but it was an interesting situation that happened at that time. So that I happened to be there at that time.
It was a moment shared.
Yeah, yes. And later on, we remembered that news came along that Hitler had known of this, and he had said, "Oh, I'll outlive him," or something like that, and said he made one of his famous comments like, "I knew I'd outlive him," or something. It was, and he only did about a week or so. There wasn't very much distance between those two deaths. Anyway, the war was right at end, and that was a much nicer trip to Paris, and I had a couple of nice days. By that time, the metros were running, and I learned how to go places. I could go out much further and ride the trains and see places, and went to a lot of buildings and churches and things that I knew about that were of musical interest to me, and Napoleon's tomb and all the things that the tourists do. And went to the Louvre, and there was not a lot of the very famous things in there, because the museums and other places that had valuable items had them taken out and taken down and stored for the duration in salt mines.
Yeah.
So we didn't get to see a lot of original things. Heavy statuary, of course, didn't move, but paintings and small statuary. The Mona Lisa was not there. Lots of things that we were looking for, but there'd be something on the wall that said what was supposed to be here and why it was gone. Later on, so on my last trip, I did get to see a lot of things later in the summer when they were beginning to restore stuff. So that was my second trip to Paris, and I went back to our headquarters in northern France, and then the next big thing was VE Day, and the war in Europe ended, and we got the good news, and late in the afternoon, and they told everybody, don't celebrate too much, and please don't shoot your rifles off the balconies and on buildings. Well, it was pop, pop, pop all over town, guys were celebrating and drinking green wine. And it was heady times, I have to say, because it was a big sigh of relief. But
when did you learn that Hitler had committed suicide?
Well, I'm trying to think, how did that happen? There was so much big stuff right there at the end. I guess it was probably the next day. We probably read it in the Stars and Stripes. We had radio, and I had a little radio that I had purloined in my room in this billet we had commandeered, and I don't know if I heard it on the radio or if I read it or heard it word of mouth.
But it was after the war was over.
Yeah, well, yeah, that last business of this was long before I went to Berlin, of course, and because we weren't even near there at that time, because that was, you know, Russian field of operation, and they captured the city, and it was later on that they divided it up. No, I was still back in the old place, way to the west. But anyway, there was a lot of rejoicing, because all we could think of was, now we're going to get to go home. Yeah. That's all everybody talked about. I talk about things now that I did that I may have enjoyed, like going to Paris, but all we want to do was do a day's work and have something to eat and get the mail call and think about going home. And mail was pretty darn good. We had very prompt delivery. I don't ever remember being without mail and little packages from home. And I had sent a letter home after the ship sinking, and I couldn't talk about it. We weren't. Everything was censored, so I just said, if you can find stuff, here's what I need. Well, it was A to Z, everything, you know, from a razor blade to a bar of soap and or whatever it was that civilians could find back here, which wasn't much. And Dad spent a lot of time scouring around Atlanta trying to find things for me. But little by little, they began to send me things that I couldn't get at the PX. And of course, I told them anytime they could send anything that I could use for trade and barter, because money was not worth a hoot. The Allies had issued paper money in Germany, and they called them what they call them, not D-marks like they did later, but anyway, they were strange-looking pieces of legal tender, and they were in various colors. And I didn't save any of them. I should have. They'd been nice souvenirs, but they really weren't worth very much. And people wanted to. The local people wanted to get something they could use or trade, like chocolate bars or cigarettes or coffee. And we were able to occasionally get a little coffee sent from home, and if it was in a tin, and boy, that was a real valuable item. And so once in a while they'd be able to send me something like that. And that was how I got my portrait painted. I had an oil portrait done in Bad Nauheim after we moved there, moved our headquarters there. And some of the guys said, well, there's a very famous artist here who paints portraits, Professor Kempen. And said, the old professor is here from Frankfurt, where he was bombed out, and he's in this little town. It's about 30, 40 miles from Frankfurt, and he set up a little studio, and some of the GIs are having their paintings. I said, what does he charge? He said, he doesn't charge. He says, you bring stuff he can barter with. So I went and talked to him and took my chocolate bars and my cigarettes and some coffee, and I had several sittings, and it now hangs in my house. I sent it to Mom. It was a full-size portrait, and beautifully done, and found out later he was fairly well known. He had done murals in the concert hall in that little town, and one of my buddies was from Boston, and his father was an art dealer, and so he mentioned it to him, and his father said, oh, we know about Professor Kempen. He was an elderly man, so he had some kind of fame here and there, and I remember one of my friends from University of Georgia, when I first got home, saw it and had been studying art over there and knew a lot about it, style, and I didn't. I just thought it looked like me. And he looked at it, he said, the artist was Florentine trained. He said, that's not a German artist. I said, well, he certainly was. He said, well, that doesn't mean where he was when he was young, where he went to school. And so I just had to assume that Professor Kempen was an Italian-trained painter. Anyhow, several of the guys had their portraits done, and we paid him in cigarettes and chocolate bars and coffee. And when I would show them this occupation money, really what it was, most of the time the people would just shake their heads. They were not interested in that. And so that was how I happened to get my portrait done. And that was one of the fun things that came out of it, and the folks were pleased, of course. And by the time I got home, my dad had taken it down to binders and had it properly mounted, framed, and treated, and It's just
That's
exactly the way it was.
I'd love to see it someday.
It's a nice painting, and it has the professor's name at the bottom, and I think he put 46 on there. I don't remember if the date was on there or not. Anyway, I was so anxious. As I said, everybody wanted to go home. And I said, I don't want my picture painted to be sitting here in a uniform. And so I knew more German than I did French, and I let the professor know. And he was a small little fellow. He went and got a little jacket of his, a little white jacket, off-white jacket. And it was like this, you know.
Yeah.
So I pulled the sleeve, took my jacket off, and got hunched over and got those sleeves down and sat in the chair like this. So there's the painting in the professor's jacket. And you can see my GI shirt. I had a GI shirt, and then the regular, we have to color your trousers. The tie was suntan. The rest was OD. Crazy little things you remember.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
That you did something with Patton after the war?
Yes, this was during that same period. In that town, they located our offices in the Grand Hotel, which was a 6-story building. This little town had not been bombed per se. A scatter bomb had come through and just dropped what, maybe they had some leftovers. They used to say that's what would happen. They'd drop them rather than going back to England with anything. So one or two had fallen, and one fell on the concert hall I mentioned that the professor had painted, but only on the stage area. And so they blocked that off and moved the stage out over the orchestra pit, and it was still a concert hall. And every Sunday afternoon we could go there and hear the Northwest German Radio Symphony play. And it was broadcast over, I can hear him saying now, here's Radio Frankfurt, and Sunday afternoon concert. And anyway, that was in Bad Nauheim. So back to the hotel where we worked every day, 6 days a week, typing away on what they call the written history of the European theater. And General Patton had been given that command to look over this. Well, that's why it was what we were up there doing all this paperwork, and they laughingly called us then the 15th Paper Army. Well, we were able to stay together a lot longer than some of the other organizations that had been over longer. They had more points. We had a point system in order to go home. And so we were later arrivals. And so Patton, you know, was known for his spit and polish. And he had his group of MPs that looked after him, I guess. And they had, you know, the helmet is a steel cask, everything, and inside is a liner that's separate. Well, by this time we were able to do away with the cask and just wear our helmet liners, and at 10 feet it looks the same. So they had these helmet liners that was snow white, and they would have his insignia on the front from his old outfit. And there must have been 6 or 7, 6 of them. It was always an even number. And he had his old Cadillac, and Willie, that white English bulldog he had that was so famous. And he and Willie would drive up to the hotel to come to work. And the 6, 3 on each side, GIs with the white helmets would stand on either side of the entrance to the hotel. And somebody would open, the driver would open the door, and the general would get out and walk between them and come right into the show. It was just, so into the lobby of the hotel, somebody would yell, "Attend," and everybody would jump up and stand there, you know, hoping he'd just get in the elevator and leave. I was not there. I was upstairs already working, and somebody reported this later, and I read it in the Reader's Digest as something. They came up and told me that Patton came through this little entourage, through the lobby, and everybody stood at attention, except one guy sitting there in a uniform, holding up the Stars and Stripes, reading the newspaper. And Patton stopped in the middle of the floor, and he turned around and he walked over. "Get up, get up, get up." And the paper came down and said, "Why? Don't you know to stand at attention when a general officer comes in the room?" He said, "But I'm a civilian." The guy had been a GI the week before. They were begging us to take civilian jobs and to stay an extra year. We didn't want to do that. He had agreed to do it. He had taken off all he had was, he did have something indicated, what was it? Well, like the Red Cross people, they had our uniforms too, but they'd had a Red Cross. He had something indicated he was a civilian now. Of course, that didn't show. He was holding up the paper. Well, the old general, they said, got red in the face. Well, you can have respect for age. That's the way the story came out, and that's the way I read it. And the guys came upstairs and had been down there and told us about it. And I wish I had been there. But that was him, the whole thing.
But you saw Patton on a regular basis?
Yes, yes. I'd see him stride in like that if I was, say, outside walking up toward the hotel. But I would see him basically, if I was so close to be at church on Sunday.
Yeah.
He'd come to church the same way with a big old Cadillac, and the guys would stand there and help him out of the car, and he'd come. Now, they didn't come inside with their helmets on, but he came in with much pomp and circumstance, and everybody just was quiet.
Were you afraid of him?
No, no. We just didn't have any contact with him, and he was, I can imagine, in view of his status and the remarkable things that he and his Third Army had done, the tank, he was a fabulous statistician and that sort of thing. He just outrunning, they would outrun their supply line. They had a terrible time keeping up with them and keeping the gasoline for the tanks. I don't know whether they were diesel, maybe whatever they were running on. That used to be a big thing, and we would see these carrier tanks just lined up everywhere trying to keep up with all of those vehicles, but he was way ahead of everybody. And they were much south in Germany toward the Munich side. But anyway, no, we just would see him maybe at church. I do remember one day though, we heard the Cadillac coming, a small town, narrow streets, and every time they'd come to a corner, they'd hit that horn, and it sounded like something on an ocean liner, a big old brrr sound. And whenever the Cadillac drove around, the general officer was in it, the license plate would be uncovered, and it would have however many stars he had. Red with the silver stars on the tag. And when he was not in it, there was a little canvas cover that went over it. Well, we were always told, Patton was so spit and polish, if you ever see that car, just stop and salute. Well, the car came around the corner, and a couple of them, so we stopped and we saluted. The tag was covered. And who's in the back seat? Willie. The old white bulldog, he's big, he's sitting in the back seat, so we saluted Willie. We thought that was funny. I don't know if the driver ever mentioned the scene, gee, I was saluting the dog. Anyway, we were billeted there for several months, and things were getting to calm down a lot, and we had seen so much, and the concentration camps had all been opened and deliberated, and we were either required to go to a camp or to go to a theater screening. The Signal Corps had made all these films that you now see here and there, and we either one of the two, and so we feigned not to. We had too much work to do. We just had to stay at work, so we would go after work to the theater and take a look, which I'm glad I did that. I mean, I'm thankful I didn't have to go and see that in those early days, because I'd seen enough, my goodness. But and the wasteland, just going through that rural area of Germany, and they called it the Ruhr Pocket. That was the last gasp of the war, and our divisions were in there, and so the only battle star that I have is called the Ruhr Pocket on my ribbon. I only have one of those because we were only involved in that one big campaign. But those cities in those small towns were just laid waste. It's unbelievable. Aachen and Cologne even. Primarily it was bombing. It was just, there's a word for it, what do they call it? Anyway, it's just sheet bombing, just solid. Because back in, before we actually got there, when we were still back in Belgium, in the daytime we would just see these flights just solid going over, the side. The sky would be black with the B-17s, B-24s, by that time they'd gone beyond what the fighter pilots could do, and so they were just alone, and that's why we lost so many bombers, because the fighter planes could only go so far because of the limitation of their fuel, and so it didn't have the range that they had much later. Anyway, we'd see that, and then at night you could look out, and it would look like the sun was rising because of the fires we could see across the river from those towns burning. And it was just unbelievable. And sometimes you could hear the concussions of the bomb falling, because it'd be miles and miles away from us. Well, anyway, getting on to more interesting things. The war was over, and it became time to dissolve the organization, and so different people from different departments, different divisions of the headquarters were assigned to this, that, and the other. One of my best friends from Atlanta was assigned to Bucharest, Romania, to go and work at the reestablished American embassy there. See, all those countries had been liberated, and we were friendly with the Russians at that time. And so I remember seeing old Brad get on the truck, and I said, well, I hope I get to see you. He said, maybe I'll see you back in Atlanta, maybe I won't. He said, I don't know where I'm going. I said, well, he knew where he was going, but he said, where are you going? I said, well, they told me I might go to Berlin. So I had my orders, and there was one other fellow, not from my outfit, he was from our headquarters. I'd seen him around. And so I got in the train, and I guess the trains, we must have left from Bad Nauheim. They had trains, well, they still are in Europe, they go everywhere. Anyway, we didn't go out of Frankfurt because the stations there were not operating. And I got in the compartment, and there was this fellow that I'd seen before I knew him, so that was somebody to talk to, because we were on a real strange journey by ourselves, and we didn't know anybody else, and we were the only ones going with the same orders to do in the same organization in Berlin, the headquarters there. So everything rocked along fine, and the train finally got to, by this time the Allies had divided up the territory, so we got to the Russian zone, and the train stopped, and we jumped a little, and we figured they were changing engines, and it was so quiet, and all of a sudden we heard big footsteps, and we looked up, and here come a whole group of Soviet soldiers walking through the train, looking at everybody's paperwork, and they were very gruff, and they were very careful about who was on those trains going through the zone. So we were just sort of sitting on pins and needles until we crossed back into the city, actually into the American zone of the city. But there was a long ride from the American or British sector in the west through the Russian sector before we got to the city of Berlin, and because it was divided into 4 parts. This was way before the wall came up. But then the city was just a pile of rubble. But there was,
what month was this?
This was been in May.
In May?
May, late May.
Okay.
Because right after I got back from that Paris trip, things began to slow down, and they began to disband. Yeah,
So
it was late May or early June, and we were housed in the suburbs. The middle of the city, of course, was a wreck, and there wasn't much there. And so we were in a factory that, well, it was a telephone factory. They were like AT&T or something. They did all telephone equipment and recording stuff. And we were in a building where they had their phonograph recording equipment. And some of their old recordings are still around. And I knew about that company, and I was really surprised to be in such a place. I said, well, I'd like to see some of this. So they took us back into the building where that kind of operation went on, and there was nothing in there but just bolts in the floor, and said that the Soviets had come in and taken all of the recording equipment and the duplicating equipment back to the old country, because the Germans had very superior, at that time, what we would have called hi-fi later.
Yeah.
They had wonderful, and their radios were far superior sounding to ours. The one I had, that I had picked up and had in my little room there, it sounded tremendous good to be a small little table radio. And so I was excited to hear about that. Being here, I am in this famous company's factory. But we didn't stay there very long. My points were coming along. I was there maybe 6 or 8 weeks. And then we got the news that the Hbomb, the secret weapon, had been dropped, you know, and the war was truly over. And so I got one of my famous Paris passes about that time and went back to Paris for a weekend. And boy, the celebrating was still going on, mostly with the Brits and us, because the French were not involved in the East at that time. So the Parisians kind of just gave the city over. And boy, the GIs and the British we were all over that town. In the other vehicles we could have celebrating, and flags flying from the vehicles, and the champagne was flowing, and it was really something. Because we knew we'd go home now. Because we would, on pins and needles, about being shipped. A lot of people were shipped from Europe over to the East. And that was the dread that we all had, because if you didn't have enough points, that's what would happen.
Yeah.
And well, anyway, I was not on VE Day, but shortly after, but the celebrating was still going on. And I remember I went in one bar celebrating, a lot of GIs with this particular bar, I don't remember the name of it, and I was sitting at the bar, and all of a sudden there's a back room where there's a show going on, and they said, "Look, here she comes, here she comes." So we all turned around to see, and here comes Marlena Dietrich. She'd been in the show with her entourage walking out of the bar, and she was about the only celebrity I ever saw except on stage. We saw a lot of USO shows. We saw a lot of famous people perform for us here and there. I remember one night we were in, just before we left Bad Nauheim, we had a concert with Jascha Heifetz, and a pianist. And he was playing the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto with a piano only, and GI playing for him. And the theater was packed. Most of these guys probably didn't know much about that kind of music, but I was thrilled. I knew the music anyway, and about halfway through, the lights went out. And the generator outside, we had to generate our own electricity because there was nothing, anything local. So the generator for the building had run out of gas. So poor guy just fumbled the piano and just finally quit. And Mr. Heifetz didn't miss a note. It was pitch dark. And he just kept right on playing. Nobody moved. It took about 4 or 5 minutes for him to get the generator going. And I'd forgotten about that. I remember now I wrote home because Mother loved that piece. And it's one reason I knew it. And I told her what had happened. And her famous violinist on my sister's recording was who we heard play in the dark.
That's incredible.
That was incredible. But actually, a person of that stature, that's a standard piece that they know. Sure. You know, I guess it wasn't that difficult for him. But the poor accompanist was just literally in the dark. But yeah, that was nice. And some of the things that I had typed up here that I've left for you folks to go with all of this was about the good parts. I wanted to include that. And so being a musician, I decided, well, I'm going to do all I can while I can. And the Russian zone was open to us, and we could take the train. There was some trains running underground in Berlin. Some were flooded on purpose with the retreating Nazi troops. And well, the people were in there not, and that was really bad because they had not gotten them all out.
Was there much carnage in Berlin when you got there?
It was all over. The only thing that we ran into was the odor coming out of the manholes. It's a swampy kind of an area. It's flat, and there's canals, so the subways were just under the street. And so it was all flooded, and it was pretty bad. There were a lot of bodies still there, but no, fortunately we were fortunate, and we weren't forced to go into the camps. As I said, we were allowed because we were office workers to go to the theater and see it. So we would make sure that we knew and understood. Anyway, getting back to that trip to Paris, that was really great because I said, I know now I'm going to go home, going to go back to the base and get my points and head for home before long. And sure enough, that's what happened. And we stayed, now I'm wrong on my months. That was in the summertime because I did have another trip back to England. And that was in the summer, and it was really, really a nice warm summer. And we didn't have any suntans. We had only our winter woolens. And boy, I'll tell you, it was hot.
Yeah.
At least with that kind of clothing. So that was nice to get back to England. And I was in London when the lights came on after all the blackout time. I remember that, and it was going to be a big affair, and the city had been dark for so long. And I was sitting on a bench down in Leicester Square in the theater district, and all of a sudden it lit up. And all the theater marquees lit up, and you could hear all this applause and people whistling, and the park was full of people waiting, you know. And it was really an exciting time. And so I enjoyed that. I had 4 or 5 days, and I was able to buy a few souvenirs that I'd lost in the ship, and went back to some of the same places and picked up stuff. And I went back and, let's see, that was, I've just got myself a little bit turned around here on my dates. But anyhow, they shipped us out of Berlin and to Bremerhaven, and that was a port of debarkation. And when I got there, we had a day or so before our troop ship was to leave. This was a larger one than the one that sunk, and I was glad of that. And they were operated by our merchant marine. I was glad to see that. And so going to the ship from where we'd been billeted in Bremerhaven, they had a motor pool, and most of the vehicles were German things. And here was this great big convertible, 4-door convertible Mercedes, painted OD, and it was huge. And the doors were so heavy. And I asked the driver about it. He said, "Oh, this is where they caught Himmler, and this was his vehicle, Heinrich Himmler, and this was his vehicle, and it was armor plated. That's why the doors were like that." And so we got to ride in that. It was a very cushy sort of thing with leather inside, you know, and took us down to the port where we took our duffel bags and got on board and started what we hoped would be a quick, safe, nice trip. And it was the worst sea trip you could imagine because there was a storm that followed us all across the Atlantic. It was wild. The first day out it started, and that ship was heeling and carried on in all directions, and one of the merchant seamen happened to talk to him, and he was, believe it or not, from Atlanta. Have we got any time?
Yeah, we got about 10 more minutes.
Yeah, and this is going to work out just right. I thought that's really strange to run into a guy from Atlanta, and he said, "Do you know Jennings' Rose Room?" I said, "Well, I've not been there because," I said, "I wasn't old enough." I said, "It was right across the street from my high school." And it's on Monroe Drive. Remember Jennings' Rose Room? Down in that hole. Well, he said, "Oh, that's where I love to go and dance." And he said, "When I'm on leave." And so he was a bit older than I guess. He was probably an old man, about 30 years old. And so he said, "Now we got ropes all over this ship." He said, "It's gonna be worse than it is now." He said, "Be sure you got a rope handy when you're outside smoking." Everybody smoked in those days. And we hit that storm, and that thing was heeling, and he said, "Well, this ship will go 47 degrees before it capsizes." I said, "Well, what's it doing now?" He said, "Well, we're up in the 40s now." He said, "But we're not worried." But that was sideways, but it would come up this way, and then you ever been in a ship, and when it raised up out of the water and come down, it's just like steel on steel.
Yeah.
And it would quiver from end to end, and then the back end would come up, and the screws would come out of the water, and the thing would shake like a dog shaking a rat. And all the bunks were hung on chains, and those chains would start rattling, and you couldn't really sleep. You had to just hold on. It was like a roller coaster. This was a good-sized trip ship, too.
Were you scared?
No. Now, I'd been through a lot of stuff. I wasn't scared. I thought it was exciting.
Even despite what had happened to you?
Yeah, well, that was different. And I knew I was headed for home, and this was Mother Nature.
Yeah. Okay.
And I said, yeah, this is not too bad. And most everybody was seasick. I didn't get seasick. I was fortunate. Everything in the galley was closed. I mean, they had thrown sawdust on the floor because they were cooking when this started, and all the food went on the floor, and the stoves were inoperable. So what we did, we braved the refrigerators, and that was great because it was stocked with fresh milk.
Yeah.
Oh, that was a real treat. And we had some other things. They had a few fresh veggies. I ended up with a gum infection because we didn't have. In England, we did get cabbage and turnips and things, but there was just not any way to give us green vegetables and whatever. And C rations and K rations they keep you alive, but there was not much to it. And anyway, it was wonderful to be able to get on that ship and eat something really, really nice. So anyway, that one, it took us 10 days to get home. We had to plow through that storm. And about 24 hours out of New York, all of a sudden it just like, it was behind us. And I saw, my first time I'd ever seen a double rainbow. And there to the west was a double rainbow. I said, that bodes something nice. And the next morning we cruised right into New York Harbor, and there was the Statue of Liberty. And I said, well, this is just wonderful. And I just got real homesick and just teary. And then a big old Staten Island ferry goes across in front of it and had a great big old sign written on the side of it, welcome home, because they were crossing in front of all these troop ships coming home. And so that was kind of nice.
What month was that?
That was in April. New York was warm. And we landed in New Jersey, and I came home with a field artillery unit. Got about a couple of minutes. This is kind of funny. Any group going home, they just take miscellaneous people who were alone, assign them. So they assigned me to this field artillery unit. And so the first time that I went to the orderly room, there were 4 or 5 of us there, and they said, well, go out there and the sergeant will show you how we're going to cosmoline these guns. And they had to pack all this field artillery in all this grease to put them on the deck to get them home without being damaged by sea air. So I said, this doesn't sound like any fun at all. So I was the last one out of the orderly room, and the first sergeant was sitting there doing the morning report with his fingers. And I said, Sergeant, if you need any help with typing later, I said, that's what I've done all during the service. And so I went up. He said, stop. He said, do you type? I said, well, sure, that's all I do. He said, you're not going to fool with those guns. Come back in here. So he put me to typing, and I typed, when I could, I typed all the way across the Atlantic, doing all of the discharge work for all the people that he was in charge of. And my typewriter was in a box, screwed down, and you would open the box, turn it over, and there was the typewriter, and the box was the table.
Yeah.
Then you'd turn it over and put the other part back on. That's the way they seal them up. So I'd have to sit at a bunk with a little table between my legs because we were pitching. So, but I got used to that too. And so one officer, one lieutenant, and I disbanded that field artillery unit going across the Atlantic in the last couple of days in New Jersey. We were the last ones. And he may have belonged to it. I didn't. But I said, this is a funny way to end my Army career. But I did get to go to Manhattan. And that was nice. And then shipped us back to Fort Bragg. And then the medics checked my gums and said, well, you've got to have penicillin.
Yeah.
I said, oh my. Another day before I can get, so you can't go home like this. So I had to take extra 2 or 3 days. So they said, now you go down to the clinic. And I said, where is it? He said, well, it's this one down there with the green light on it. I said, that's the VD clinic. He said, same thing, but all getting the penicillin before we go home. Well, everybody thought I was going home with venereal disease. They picked on me again, and I just had this gum infection. But it wasn't so advanced. I didn't lose any teeth. I came home to my good family dentist, and I still got them.
Were they glad to see Take Me?
Oh, man. Yeah, we transferred trains in Columbia and then came in on the old Georgia line, and down. I remember coming right by what Georgia State down by Decatur Street. My dad's office was right off of there, the hardware company he worked in. And I said, boy, I won't be long before I'll see the old guy. It sure was wonderful. I got a cab and I was trying to sneak up on Mama. Of course, they knew I was in the States. I'd called. So my sister was looking out the window. And she saw the cab stop next door. I tried to stop next door and sneak in on him. So I didn't. I just came out and I had my discharge in my hand and I said, here it is. Mama said, what? I said, my discharge. She wasn't worried about that. She just wanted to hug on me. It sure was a great day.
Jack, what do you want to tell future generations?
Looking back on it now, I have to say I'm thankful that we ended up the way we did. Because if we hadn't, goodness knows where we would be now, or how long it would have taken us to pull out of whatever would have ensued. If Britain had fallen and we had not. We had fallen, it would have been strange. So that was a great moment in Western civilization as far as I'm concerned, and I'm glad we were there with our allies. And we are, as far as I can tell, and with the things that have gone on since, and wars and wars and wars, but we still have our freedom, and we sort of locked it in, I think, at that time. And I just hope and pray that it will stay that way. But I guess it's like the good book says, there'll be wars and rumors of wars, and that seems to be the way it is. But we just have to grin and bear it. But I'm real proud of what we did, and I was proud to be a little bit a part of it. And I'm really proud right now that we have that beautiful memorial on the mall in Washington. 40 or 50 years too late. So many guys that I saw it last year. A pastor friend of mine took me out there, and when I walked up to it, I just suddenly saw it. I just couldn't believe how beautiful it was. And all I could tell him, I said, I just wish that so and so and so and so and so and so, naming all my buddies that are gone, could be there to see it. But I said, well, at least I got to see it. It's a wonderful thing.
I got to see you and know you, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have been privileged to interview you these 2 sessions.
It's been a pleasure, Doctor, and it's been nice to know you, and I hope this is of interest to somebody.
It's going to be of great interest. And again, I express my sincere appreciation on behalf of my generation and generations after us for all you and your people did for us.
Well, we're thankful. Thank you very much for those kind words.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.